Thank you, Mr. Geiger. Okay. At this point, we will begin member questions of the witnesses. I want to point out that we predict votes to begin in the next 15 to 30 minutes. The timing may work out just about right. Hopefully it will. We've had a lot of input today, and we appreciate it, and we want to be sure we get all the way to the very end and get all the questions asked and answered. As members know, we're limited to 5 minutes for our questions. If they have additional questionings, we may be able to do a second round. If not, we can certainly submit them in writing and get responses offline. I now recognize myself for 5 minutes. Mr. Andrews, the majority of witnesses here today seem to believe that the amount of information available to fishery managers is insufficient to meet the new requirements of the Magnuson Act. How do you suggest Congress deal with this concern? And I'll just point out, particularly in this panel, I'm just hearing story after story, very credible, of how this is garbage in, garbage out type of proposition. So I'd love to get your perspective, how you think we could improve that.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You know, I mentioned earlier that Mr. Whitman and several bipartisan members of the full Resources Committee have set forth the Fishery Science Improvement Act, H.R. 2304. You know, indeed, we see some garbage in and some garbage out, but I do want to give credit where credit is due. Where there is a legitimate, scientifically prepared stock assessment that comes up with some good science, we all want science. I mean, goodness, Jane Lubchenco, you know, a scientist is the head of NOAA. We want to make sure that there's good science there, and we don't want to dog the actual stock assessments that are out there. But the 80% of the stocks of fish that the federal government doesn't know anything about from a true scientific, from a true quantitative method, that's what the members have stepped up to tackle with the Fisheries Science Improvement Act. What Congressman Whitman's bill says is that when there is no indication of overfishing and the agency has not done a stock assessment in the last 5 years, then let's suspend the annual catch limit requirement on that particular stock. We're not saying let's cast out good science with bad. I heard my fellow panelist earlier comment about, you know, there are other important sciences like biology. You know, that's great, but that doesn't tell us a thing about the number of fish that are out there, and we have the capability to discern those scientific facts. We just don't have the facts, and then we're rushing to meet a statutory deadline that was arbitrarily, it's an arbitrary deadline. So let's give science a chance to work. Let's figure out how many fish are out there, how many fish can come out of a fishery. I think everyone at the table would be fine with that.
Well, thank you for that. You know, we've had NOAA here testifying. We had a gentleman from NOAA here a little earlier on the other panel. And one of the things we're seeing is that NOAA wants to, and I mentioned this in my original comments, NOAA wants to put more of their resources into satellites to monitor climate change and that sort of thing. Significant amounts of money, and yet we're, you know, the way things are up here, we're out of money. We're broke. Washington is broke. So I guess my question is, with this tight budget situation, what do you suggest we do? What are some other options that may be available?
Well, I think that the legislative proposal that I mentioned earlier, H.R. 2304, really comes at a good time, both for the agency and for the country. You know, these next few years will not see increased budgets in pretty much any federal agency. And if we know that NOAA Fisheries is using a swag, a scientific wild guess, to determine a hard number that shall not be exceeded. This is probably a good time to say, you know, we might have gone a little overboard. You know, this whole push to establish a hard ACL is about employment of a different type that we've not spoken of today. It's about employment for environmental lawyers, because a federal judge may not really be that interested in the Byzantine fishery management discussion, but a federal judge understands a number. And once there is a number set forth that the widget fish, or the whatever fish, the ACL on the widget fish shall be X. Once that number, that swag, that dart thrown at the wall, once that number is exceeded, we're going to be guaranteeing full-time employment for environmental lawyers to be suing NOAA Fisheries for generations to come. Now's a good time for us to take a breath and say, let's go forth with the science that we've got, and what we don't have, let's stop guessing.
Okay. Well, thank you. Yeah, my time is up, so I'll yield to the gentleman, Mr. Sablon, ranking member.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Data is important. I'm from the islands, and I know what fishing is about. We fish for meals, and data is actually so important. And I'm going to sort of sidetrack here, is that there's some people in the country who doubt climate change. And for those who doubt the scientists, the scientific information on climate, I actually can take you to my islands where I'll show you land that's underwater, and it's only could be attributed to climate change. But Mr. Geiger, you have been involved with fisheries management in the South Atlantic, sir, for many, many years, several decades actually. So can you tell us how successful the Council was at ending and preventing overfishing prior to and following the 2006 reauthorization of the Magnuson-Stevens Act?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Sablon. Actually, the councils were abject failures at ending overfishing. If you look at the South Atlantic Council, since 1984, at the implementation of the first snapper grouper fishery management plan and all subsequent plans, we're now up to fishery management plans for snapper grouper. I think we're on 21 or 22. Only three met the management objectives, and two of the fisheries were closed. One for 5 years, Goliath grouper, was the other one that was closed has been closed since 1992. In all cases, short-term economic considerations were always used as a determinant in an effort to try and reduce the effects of the regulation, or reduce the regulations that needed to be put in place. So if they knew they needed to do something, they received advice that, well, you could back off it a little bit, and it was always due because of the public outcry based on short-term economics. And when we adjusted the bag limits, the size limits, the trip limits, whatever the standard methodology was used for that particular stock at the time, those reductions resulted in a failed rebuilding, or a failed result from the management that we attempted to put in place. And I mean, the record stands for itself, which is exactly why Congress reauthorized the Act in 06 as they did, with the intent to finally get the councils to end overfishing and take that discretionary ability the councils had to consider short-term economics at the peril of the fish stocks.
So how important have the new requirements for annual catch limits and accountability measures been to the success of the Management Council, South Atlantic Management Council, in ending and preventing overfishing?
Well, I think they're absolutely key to ending overfishing, and it's because the standard methodologies that have been in the toolbox and employed by the councils, limiting anglers to a bag limit, season closures, trip limits, size limits, those type of things, have proven they really are not very effective, because they don't cap the total number of fish that can be taken out of the water on an annual basis in the species. So without limiting that cap, or without limiting the amount of mortality that occurs within that fishery, there's no way to stop it. So overfishing will generally continue. Unless there's a cap, you can stop it. And if you do go over it, there needs to be an absolute payback to get back on track of the rebuilding plan.
And I can certainly understand that, Mr. Geiger, because where at one time, where I come from, half a mile out from the reef, you get your first bite tuna. Now you got to go 3-4 miles at least because overfishing, and it's not from us actually, it's from other parts. I mean, you know, commercial fishing that passes through the island. So.
And if I may add to the response to your question, sir, we've seen successes, and we see successes. One of the congressmen mentioned black sea bass. You know, black sea bass is one of those stories that's a success in the South Atlantic, a failure and a success. We had 2 rebuilding plans on black sea bass, both of which failed. Finally, in Amendment 13C in 2004, we put some very severe limits on black sea bass. And of course, the council voted for a constant catch rebuilding strategy, which allows the removal of 104,000 pounds of fish annually until you get to a certain point as the stock recovers, then you can begin to increase those removals as the stock demonstrates it's recovered.
I have one more question before. The House Appropriations Committee has proposed cuts to fisheries research and management, including funds to expand annual stock assessments and for cooperative research with states. What do you see as the consequences of such cuts for rebuilding stocks and for fishermen? Mr. Geiger again.
Well, I'm opposed to any cuts and reductions of any funding for stock assessments and certainly for data improvement. I came on the council from Coastal Conservation Association, and for 19 years I fought this federal process, and we fought the Federal National Marine Fisheries Service over the failed data that they use to manage the stocks. And it's evident based on the condition of the stocks we see today in the South Atlantic and the fact that we have to take such draconian measures to try and recover these stocks. So I certainly am a supporter of improving data, but it takes 10 years to build a 10-year data set. And it takes years to train stock assessment scientists. You don't just go out on the street and put an ad in the newspaper and hire stock assessment scientists off the street. And to NOAA's credit, they have a program at Virginia Tech in an effort to try and recruit mathematicians and young mathematics majors who have the abilities to perform these highly complex mathematical models. And recognizing budget limitations, we are where we are. If we don't put ACLs in place and we go back to what we were doing before, we're going to use the same data that everybody is calling garbage or deficient or bad to do what? Set bag limits and trip limits and all the things that have failed in the past. We're going to go back to that methodology? ACLs are the answer. We need to have the courage to stay with it, move forward. We actually are seeing benefits resulting from ACLs that are put on stocks, and I think we'll see more if we just have the courage to stay the course.
Okay, the gentleman yields back. Votes have been called, so we'll try to get through another 2 or 3 questioners, do the best we can to finish out, and then we'll have to adjourn because we'll have votes for another hour and a half, and then we've got something after that. So with that, I think next up is Mr. Duncan, South Carolina.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll be very quick. Mr. Geiger, I heard you make a comment about 10-year data set as being part of any study or any determination of closures. And I just ask you, are you aware of any 10-year data set on the red snapper that was included that helped them lead them to the conclusion of closing the South Atlantic?
Yes.
So why are we making the decision based on no data set?
No, there were the headboat. The headboat indices is over 10 years old. It's the longest dependent fishery dependent indices that we have, and it was used in the red snapper stock assessment.
How far do headboats go out?
Oh, I think back to the 80s, maybe 86, 84, 86. I don't have it in front of me, but I know it's our oldest dependent data set, and that stock assessment. If we had the time, and I could talk to you directly about that stock assessment. That stock assessment reflected clearly the condition of the stock that we heard based on the anecdotal information of the fishermen that provided us testimony. We knew there were a large number of fish out there. The problem is they were all under the 20-inch size limit, and people were wading through a large number of them to get to the 20-inch fish that they could keep. And when you look at a classic fishery and you look at the age structure of fish, prior to this, they thought red snapper only lived to be 24 years old. Based on aging studies that they did in preparation for CDAR 15, they found that the oldest fish that they measured was 53 years old. And when you look at the age of the over 8,000 otoliths that they sampled and aged, when you look at that age curve, there was a sharp, I mean a precipitous straight down decline after age 4 out to age 9, and then basically from age 9 out to 53, there were virtually no representative samples of those age fish in that stock that was sampled. And they took over 8,000 samples. So then, subsequent to that, and prior to doing CDAR 24, the Science Center actually went to the dock and cherry-picked large fish that were caught that people suspected were older than the average age that was portrayed in the stock assessment. And they found that there was no real age correlation in red snapper between age and length. So you can have young fish that appear to be large, and you can have older fish that aren't as large as the younger fish. So there's no direct correlation. And what they found when they cherry-picked all these large fish, they found that the age actually mirrored what was in the stock assessment based on the 8,000 samples that they aged. And oh, by the way, the Science Center also conducted a long-line survey offshore because there was some stock that the commercial fisher, or some people felt was beyond where the current recreational fishery prosecuted the fishery, and the commercial fishery prosecuted it. They were deep water fish, and that's where all the big fish were, and were not considered.
Not to cut you off, but I am on my time here and about to run out. I would like for you, if you don't mind, to provide this committee with the sources and the data that you're mentioning today, because I have yet to see that.
I would be absolutely delighted
because the captains I talked to basically repudiate that. But Captain Nelson, do you recognize this? Could you tell me what this is?
That's a series of emails. 73, I believe, is the, I think that's the number. 73 emails concerning the red snapper science over a period of about 18 months that I sent to National Marine Fisheries Service, the Council, South Atlantic Council, and Eric Schwab, different groups.
And I read through a bunch of these, and Mr. Chairman, I would like to submit this as part of the record, allow the other committee members to look at it. But one of the emails that I see here back in December of 2010, this was to Dr. Roy Crabtree, and this is what Captain Nelson says: "Are we to believe that the red snapper in the Gulf of Mexico are highly productive and that the same exact species in the Atlantic is not? The only difference in that spawner recruitment science for the two assessments is one has data and the other does not. Therefore, the people in the Gulf of Mexico are fishing and making a living, and the people in the South Atlantic are not because of lack of data, not lack of fish." And we can show based on the catch surveys that Captain Nelson and I have talked about would differ from what the fishery NMFS has. So I'm going to submit this for the record. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Without objection, so ordered. We're down to 8 minutes, 55 seconds. I know Mr. Pallone has not had a chance to ask, so I'm going to basically make Mr. Pallone our last person to ask questions so we can make it to our vote. So, Mr. Pallone, you have 5 minutes, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just wanted to say that in order to provide for a sustainable future and ensure economic prosperity today, Magnus and Stevens aim to balance conservation with fishing opportunities in an informed and scientific way. But I'm afraid, however, that because we can build a lack of information into our scientific models, we've lost the balance, and instead fisheries managers use uncertain and unreliable information as a scientific basis for their decisions. And that's why I introduced the Coastal Jobs Creation Act, because I'm frustrated with a lack of scientific data and management. My bill would invest in successful programs that are specifically targeted at aiding coastal communities and creating jobs, because without the scientific data collection that my bill prioritizes, we would continue to reduce fishing quotas, not because the science tells us we must, but because we're simply compensating for the unknown. Now, I wanted to ask Mr. Greg DiDomenico, good to see you, a couple of questions along this, in the same regard. NIMS has had closures in fisheries like snapper and black sea bass in instances where the stock is not overfished. In other words, it's a healthy stock, but the current rate of removal is too high. In other words, overfishing is occurring. In these particular instances, it makes intuitive sense that we should allow a more tailored management response, such as specifying a reduced rate of fishing for a period of time, rather than requiring an outright closure that hurts jobs and coastal economies. What specifically needs to be changed in the Act to give you this flexibility, and would you welcome such flexibility? And I'm going to try to get through a few of these, so if you don't mind, Greg.
Sure. Are you asking that specifically for black sea bass?
No, just in general. I mean, in other words, closures are closures, whereas, there should be some flexibility, in my opinion. But what do we need to do to change Magnuson in order to accomplish that?
Well, I would say that I'm going to use your example of black sea bass. It affects the recreational community much more, especially the closures, than the commercial industry. But I would say the first thing that we should do is put back the $4 million that was taken, well, not taken, but the NOAA budget. As you know, in 2012, their request moved $4 million from cooperative research to go to cooperative research on catch shares. Now, some of the examples that I used today rely or provide a very good example of where cooperative research has helped. In my opinion, putting that money back into cooperative research with recreational and commercial fishermen would be the way to go.
Okay. Let me ask you this. Under current law, the Regional Fisheries Management Council is required to include a fishery impact statement for each management plan or amendment to that plan, and this impact statement is supposed to evaluate the economic impact of the plan or the amendment and possible mitigation measures. Since these impact statements are only done with a new management plan or amendment, do you believe that NOAA and the Commerce Department have up-to-date information on the impacts fisheries management is having on local fishermen? And do you believe, comment to me on these impact statements and, how valuable they are and whether we need something else.
They're valuable in time, but what has occurred in the past is that the cumulative impacts of regulations over time have not been accurately assessed. And that's for both recreational and commercial industries.
Well, now let me ask you the last thing. As you know, I introduced in the last Congress, and we're going to do another flexibility in rebuilding American Fisheries Act, a Magnuson Amendment. I've been hearing concerns from the fishing community about the regional councils ratcheting down quotas because of lack of scientific certainty. Do you have any other suggestions for how we can ensure fishermen have access to healthy stocks that are not overfished in light of the fact that fishery managers are, I think, compensating for uncertainty in effect?
Yes. Have this subcommittee make achieving MSY, maximum sustainable yield, back to the cornerstone of Magnuson-Stevens Act. Make it a national policy. I briefly went through the quota setting process. And if you allow me 30 seconds, I'll give you a good example. And I think my request to have the agency provide you the numbers species by species, which they can do, to show you the reductions. I'm going to give you approximate numbers. We have a spiny dogfish fishery throughout the entire East Coast. It is a shared stock with the Canadians. The OY is approximately 20,000 metric tons. We reduced that by 25%. So you, OY or MSY, reduce it to 15. Then we take off another 6,000 metric tons for discards, both fisheries, and the possible Canadian catch, leaving us with 9. That example may not be perfect for every species, but when when the agency shows you where they start, where we could fish up to, I think we are overly cautious and are risking missing reaching MSY on many stocks. I think that'll give you the information that you need. Thank you.
All right. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman yields back. Members of the subcommittee may have additional questions for witnesses, and we ask that you respond to these in writing. The hearing record will be open for 10 days to receive these responses. Finally, I want to thank members and staff for their contributions to this hearing. If there is no further business, without objection, the subcommittee stands adjourned. And thank you again, witnesses.